There is a particular humiliation peculiar to the modern world. It is not merely that one is lied to. Human beings have always lied. It is not merely that one is sold things one does not need. Civilizations have always had hucksters. It is not even that one is surrounded by imitation, performance, pretense, and spiritual fraudulence. Every age has known counterfeit. No, the specific humiliation of our age is this. We are increasingly asked to live among fakes while pretending not to notice. Fake enthusiasm, fake rebellion, fake art, fake intimacy, fake politics, fake language, fake selves. And after a while, the danger is no longer only that one is deceived. The danger is that one loses the instinct for recognition itself. That is why William Gaddis's The Recognitions remains such a viciously relevant novel. First published in 1955, built around forgery, fraud, imitation, spiritual bankruptcy, and the corruption of art by commerce, it was initially mauled by reviewers and only later recognized as one of the major American novels of the post-war period. Britannica calls it a multi-leveled examination of spiritual bankruptcy. New York Review Books describes it as a masterpiece about fraud and forgery. And that is why it matters now. Because The Recognitions is not only a novel about forged paintings, it is a novel about a forged world. A world in which value is detached from truth. A world in which appearance circulates more efficiently than substance. A world in which the market does not merely sell objects, but colonizes standards. A world, in short, alarmingly like our own. At the center of the novel stands Wyatt Guyan, the gifted painter drawn into producing old master forgeries for a dealer who can sell them as newly discovered originals. Around him, Gaddis constructs an immense social landscape full of plagiarism, imitation, mistaken identity, counterfeit piety, empty talk, and people performing versions of themselves in the hope that performance might become reality. Now, that may sound forbiddingly literary, and one can already hear the protest from those who break out in hives whenever a novel exceeds the length of a sandwich. But stay with me, because this book is not merely a difficult classic. It is a map of one of the central moral questions of modern life. How does one keep one's soul intact in a culture that rewards imitation? That is the real question. Not merely how to be successful, not merely how to be visible, not merely how to avoid embarrassment while navigating the modern carnival of branding, networking, posting, optimizing, and monetizing. How to remain real. How to avoid becoming, in your speech, your work, your tastes, your loves, and eventually your very conscience, a forgery of yourself. Because that is what a commercialized world does if left unresisted. It does not necessarily force you into open corruption. That would be almost easier. Open corruption at least possesses the merit of candor. No, it does something subtler. It tempts you to become derivative. It asks you to shape your life around legibility, to turn your inner life outward for sale, to speak in phrases already approved, to desire what is socially rewarded, to perform the version of yourself most likely to circulate successfully. And because this often works, because performance is indeed rewarded, because imitation is often profitable, because style can outpace substance for quite a long time, many people begin to suspect that authenticity is for fools. That is precisely the suspicion Gaddis goes after, with a kind of savage patience. The novel's world is saturated with counterfeit, not because everyone is twirling a villain's mustache, but because modernity has created an environment in which the copy, the pose, the imitation, and the marketable surface proliferate more efficiently than the genuine article. Scholars and critics have long treated forgery and authenticity as central to the book, and recent criticism has also emphasized its portrayal of a society increasingly organized by exchange value. That phrase, exchange value, sounds hideous, and rightly so. It is the sort of phrase that ought to be dropped from a considerable height onto the heads of economists and administrators. But it captures something important. A thing may have intrinsic worth, or it may merely circulate well. These are not the same. A painting may reveal vision, discipline, mystery, reverence, or it may simply fetch a price. A human being may possess integrity, courage, depth, or he may simply be marketable. A book may enlarge the soul, or it may merely become content. And once a culture loses confidence in the difference between these things, it begins to rot from within. That is what The Recognitions sees with unnerving clarity. It sees that commercialization does not only cheapen goods, it cheapens judgment. It trains people to ask the wrong questions. Not, is this true? But, will this sell? Not, is this beautiful? But, will this circulate? Not, is this worth devoting a life to? But, can this be leveraged? Not, is this man honorable? But, is he impressive? And once those substitutions become habitual, the counterfeit no longer appears counterfeit. It appears normal. This is one reason the novel feels prophetic. We now inhabit a world in which forgery has become metaphysical. One no longer needs to fake old master paintings. One may fake one's convictions, one's politics, one's intimacy, one's originality, one's outrage, one's sophistication, one's woundedness, one's authenticity itself. The counterfeit has gone interior. And because digital life has made performance constant, the temptation is no longer occasional. It is ambient. Every platform asks, who are you in a form that can be displayed? Every institution asks, what version of yourself is easiest to process? Every market asks, what in you can be packaged? Every social environment asks, what costume will be rewarded here? And over time, the self begins to answer in costume. This is where Gaddis becomes not merely satirical, but metaphysical. Because the real horror in The Recognitions is not that fake paintings are passed off as real. It is that human beings lose contact with whatever in them is not for sale. That is the deeper counterfeit, the forgery of the soul. Now, one must be careful not to turn authenticity into another piece of scented nonsense. The modern world already contains too many people talking tediously about being their true self, by which they usually mean indulging whatever mood currently occupies the premises. Authenticity is not mere spontaneity. It is not blurting out desire and calling the mess sincerity. It is not emotional leakage. It is not branding oneself as unfiltered. Quite the contrary. Personal integrity, the thing this novel can teach us to fight for, is not a matter of self-expression alone. It is a matter of inner coherence, of not saying one thing while serving another, of not praising truth while worshipping status, of not speaking the language of depth while living entirely on surfaces, of not pretending that what is convenient is what is right. Integrity is expensive, which is why a superficial world tries to make it seem eccentric. A world organized around image, transaction, and social theater cannot openly declare war on integrity, because integrity still enjoys ceremonial prestige. So instead, it undermines integrity indirectly. It rewards flexibility where fidelity would matter. It praises adaptability where what it means is moral plasticity. It encourages endless reinvention so that no previous self may accuse the current one of betrayal. It replaces standards with vibes, conviction with posture, and vocation with networking. And the modern person, eager not to be left behind, begins to comply. He curates, he optimizes, he tailors his speech. He learns which opinions are safe in which rooms. He becomes dexterous in presentation and hollow at the center. And then, occasionally, usually in private and without an audience, he feels something like nausea. Good. That nausea is one of the last defenses left. It is recognition trying to happen. One of the remarkable things about the Recognitions is that it understands fraud not as a merely legal or aesthetic category, but as a spiritual condition. The book began as a parody of Faust and carries strong religious and mythic concerns. Critics and publishers alike have emphasized its preoccupation with art, religion, spiritual exhaustion, and authenticity. This is important because commercialized societies often flatten moral questions into technical ones. Was the deal smart? Did it scale? Was the product effective? Did the audience respond? Did the transaction clear? All perfectly useful questions if one is running a hedge fund or a moderately sinister carnival. But none of them touches the real matter. What is this making of you? That is the neglected question. And Gaddis, by filling the novel with false copies, false performances, false devotions and exhausted forms, compels the reader to ask it again and again. What is this making of Wyatt? What is this making of the artist? What is this making of the critic, the collector, the priest, the lover, the social climber, the fraud, the hanger-on? What is this making of a society in which imitation is not merely tolerated, but rewarded? It is making people spiritually second-hand. That, I think, is one of the finest phrases available for the modern condition. Spiritually second-hand. Not exactly evil, not even necessarily insincere in every moment, but derivative, borrowed, composed of echoes, unable to stand in immediate relation to truth because there is always a layer of mediation, posture, or market calculation in the way. And it turns out that living second-hand is exhausting. This is why so many superficially successful people seem inwardly depleted. They have mastered performance, but not presence. They have acquired recognition in the social sense, while losing the faculty of recognition in the moral sense. They can detect trends, opportunities, optics, cues. They cannot always detect what is worthy. This failure of discernment is one of the central challenges of a commercial civilization. For commercial civilization is very good at making things visible and very bad at ranking them correctly. It floods you with options while corroding the standards by which options should be judged. Hence the peculiar confusion of modern life. Everything is available. Very little feels authoritative. Everything can be purchased. Almost nothing feels consecrated. Everything has a price. Very little has weight. And in such a world, the artist, the thinker, and indeed any serious person faces a specific temptation to surrender the difficult labor of making something true and instead make something legible. That is the bargain of superficiality. Not be false in some melodramatic way. Simply, be easier to digest. Be more predictable, more brandable, more marketable, less difficult, less exacting, less resistant to trend, less answerable to standards higher than demand. This is how commerce enters the soul. not first by commanding betrayal, but by rewarding simplification. And that is why the Recognitions is so useful now for anyone who wishes to remain whole, because it insists that the counterfeit can succeed socially, while still being spiritually ruinous. That is a lesson modern people desperately need. We have been taught to equate success with vindication. If the audience applauds, the market rewards, the peers approve, the metrics rise, then the thing must be justified. Mustn't it? No, that is precisely the lie. A forged painting may fetch a fortune. A false persona may acquire admiration. A hollow worker may become fashionable. A compromised conscience may function very efficiently in public life. The success of the fake does not make it real, and the popularity of the superficial does not rescue it from shallowness. This is where the novel's severity becomes genuinely cleansing. It reminds us that the deepest tribunal is not the market, not the crowd, not the critic, not the career, not even posterity in the cheap sense of visibility. The deepest tribunal is whether one has falsified oneself. That is the charge one must live under. Not, am I admired? Not, am I current? Not, am I winning? But, have I become counterfeit? There is no more serious question. Now, one reason people avoid it is that personal integrity sounds expensive because it is expensive. To maintain integrity in a superficial, commercialized world means accepting several deeply unfashionable burdens. It means disappointing some audiences. It means being less efficient socially. It means refusing certain profitable lies. It means not converting every conviction into performance. It means accepting obscurity over self-betrayal at times. It means tolerating the fact that depth is often slower to recognize than surface. In short, it means choosing substance even when surface would pay better. And that is hard. Hard for artists. Hard for thinkers. Hard for young people. Hard for anyone trying to build a life in public. Hard, especially because our age is constantly whispering that everything should be monetized, networked, optimized, and distributed. But some things die under that treatment. Reverence dies. Conscience dies. Silence dies. Exactitude dies. And sooner or later, the inner authority, without which no serious work and no serious life can survive. This is why Gaddis matters beyond literature. He shows us that personal integrity is not a decorative virtue. It is the condition under which recognition itself remains possible. If you are thoroughly compromised by social imitation and commercial self-adjustment, you cannot even see clearly anymore. Your perceptions are corrupted by need, the need to fit, to sell, to circulate, to be approved, to remain legible to the market and the crowd. Then everything starts looking equivalent. This is the true disaster. Not merely bad taste, not merely moral compromise, but the collapse of discrimination, the inability to distinguish the true from the plausible, the beautiful from the fashionable, the original from the recombinant, the living from the merely animated. Once that faculty goes, you are lost in a very profound sense, and a commercialized world has every incentive to help you lose it, because a person with strong powers of recognition is difficult to manage. He notices, he compares, he refuses euphemism, he hears dead language and identifies it as dead. He sees posturing and calls it posturing. He notices when institutions praise freedom while rewarding conformity, when markets praise individuality while mass-producing selves, when culture praises originality while circulating imitations at scale. In other words, he becomes inconvenient. And superficial worlds dislike inconvenient people, which is why one of the first pressures such worlds exert is the pressure toward bad faith politeness. Not honesty, but smoothness. Not truth, but presentability. Not inward certainty, but outward adaptiveness. One learns to use the proper language while privately hollowing out the meaning. This is, of course, one of the oldest forms of corruption. But modern commercial life has industrialized it. One sees it everywhere. In corporate speech, in institutional speech, in personal branding, in moral performance, in the conversion of every private grief into public identity, in the bizarre modern trick of commodifying authenticity itself. We are now invited to be real in carefully monetizable formats. That is not reality. That is themed sincerity. And Gaddis, with his furious fascination for forgery and substitution, helps us recover a needed disgust for all this. Disgust is underrated. It is often the beginning of moral intelligence. When one begins to feel disgust, not prudishness, not social embarrassment, but genuine metaphysical disgust, at the endless counterfeiting of language, art, feeling, and personhood, one may at last be ready to live differently. Not theatrically, not as a snob, not by retreating to a monastery with 3 difficult books and a superior expression, but by recovering standards. That is always the beginning. A superficial world destroys integrity chiefly by dissolving standards and replacing them with circulation. So if one wishes to remain intact, one must restore standards privately before one can live by them publicly. Standards in work, standards in speech, standards in friendship, standards in what one consumes, standards in what one refuses to pretend not to see. You do not beat superficiality by denouncing it in grand language while secretly desiring all its rewards. You beat it by becoming less purchasable, less vulnerable to flattery, less willing to counterfeit your own convictions, less eager to be seen at the expense of being true, less available for moral and aesthetic bribery. This, incidentally, is why difficult books still matter. A book like The Recognitions asks too much of the reader for the commercial age to approve of it easily. It is long, elusive, crowded, often demanding. Jonathan Franzen once called it the most difficult book he ever voluntarily read, and Gaddis himself openly said he asked a great deal of readers. Excellent. One should occasionally be asked a great deal, because difficulty is one of the remaining ways the soul is reminded that it need not live at the speed of commerce. A demanding work of art says, in effect, slow down, attend, discriminate, submit yourself to something not organized around your convenience. That is already an antidote to superficiality. It is also a form of moral training. For the superficial, commercialized world trains us to expect instant legibility and immediate return. A serious work does the opposite. It refuses to flatter. It withholds. It tests your patience, your memory, your seriousness, your willingness to be temporarily at sea. And by enduring that, one becomes a little less market-made, a little less standardized, a little less addicted to instant recognition, a little more capable of fidelity to things that do not reveal their value immediately. That is no small gain. In fact, it may be the very foundation of integrity, because personal integrity requires one to remain loyal to what is true before social confirmation arrives, to continue the work before applause, to preserve standards before reward, to resist corruption before anyone notices. It is, in that sense, the opposite of a performance. And this is where the Recognitions becomes not just diagnostic, but instructive. It teaches, first, that the false can be brilliant and still false. Second, that the market can validate corruption. Third, that imitation can become so successful it threatens to erase the appetite for the real. And fourth, that if one does not actively cultivate recognition, moral, aesthetic, spiritual recognition, one will drift into the counterfeit by default. That is the hard lesson. The counterfeit is not an exceptional event in modern life. It is the path of least resistance. So what must one do? One must become the sort of person for whom the path of least resistance is no longer acceptable. One must learn to hear falsity in language, to distrust overly marketable versions of the self, to notice when one's tastes are becoming second-hand, to ask relentlessly, would I still value this if it did not circulate well? To ask, am I choosing this because it is true or because it is legible? To ask, what in my life has become performance? To ask, where have I accepted imitation because the real thing was too difficult, too slow, too costly? These are brutal questions. Good again. A life without brutal questions usually becomes decorative, and there are already too many decorative lives in the world. The point of integrity is not to seem admirable. It is to remain unfragmented, to avoid the split between what one says and what one serves, to avoid becoming a technician of appearances, to avoid the quiet self-contempt that arrives when one discovers one has spent years improving one's packaging while neglecting one's substance. That self-contempt is one of the hidden epidemics of the age. Many people are not merely anxious or tired. They are dimly aware that they have become insincere in ways too pervasive to confess easily. They have become, in speech and habit, approximations of what the world rewards. And because this has yielded some benefits, money, approval, belonging, movement through systems, they cannot quite abandon it. So they live in a state of low-grade fraudulence. Again, The Recognitions understands this better than most modern sermons disguised as novels. It understands that fraudulence is not merely criminal, it is existential. And that once it enters the self, everything becomes harder. Love, art, vocation, prayer, friendship, speech, even perception. Because the false self can do many things it cannot truly recognize. That is why the title is so brilliant. Recognition is not merely identification. It is acknowledgement. It is seeing and assenting. It is the soul saying, yes, that is real. And that capacity is what a superficial, commercialized world steadily erodes. Which is why one must fight for it. Not occasionally. Daily. Fight for silence. Fight for standards. Fight for difficulty. Fight for language not wholly captured by trend and utility. Fight for work done well, even when no one is looking. Fight for forms of loyalty that cannot be monetized. Fight, above all, against the impulse to falsify yourself in order to move more smoothly through the age. Because every age offers rewards for self-betrayal. Ours has merely made the transaction frictionless. So let the final lesson be severe. The challenge of maintaining personal integrity in a superficial, commercialized world is not solved by rhetoric, not solved by style, not solved by appearing authentic. It is solved only by repeated refusals. Refusal to counterfeit your values. Refusal to make your inner life wholly public. Refusal to substitute circulation for worth. Refusal to let the market decide what deserves reverence. Refusal to turn yourself into something easier to sell at the price of becoming harder to respect. That is what the Recognitions can still teach us. that the real may be obscure, difficult, slow, and under-rewarded, that the false may glitter, that the counterfeit may even triumph publicly for a time, but that a life built on forgery, artistic, moral, spiritual, carries within it its own punishment. It loses the power to recognize what is real. And once that is gone, one may have almost everything the age can offer, and still have lost the only thing that would make it worth having. So the task is plain. Learn to recognize, then refuse to counterfeit what you have recognized. That is integrity. And in a world drowning in surfaces, it may be the last form of freedom left.